very true. Guilty, but I was telling Saida
It's
that...
okay. It's all right.
You're still...
I don't hold a grudge.
Thank you. But let's correct the record. I'm recording now, by the way. I just turned it on, so as not to waste time. But I should mention that Star is at my aunt's house in Fairhaven, New Jersey, in her attic, because a lot of my stuff was in storage for a while. Unfortunately, I left that one there.
Oh, I thought you were going to tell me she wouldn't give it back to you because she liked it so much.
It's going now with my whole family. It's passing from hand to hand. And then I do have my lunches with Orson as well. I read that. And Henry Jaglam's been on this show. And we talked. Don't
forget my first book.
No,
Seeing is Believing.
I don't have that one, so that's. But you know what I feel like, and then I'm going to let you talk.
You don't give a shit.
I do. I was going to say is that it's always good to leave one out for a while, because then you have one to look forward to. If you read them all, then yeah.
But this one is actually sort of a sequel to that.
I see. Right, you do mention
that. But that's okay.
All right. Well, I will. I'll read it and think of it as a prequel. As opposed to this one being a sequel, right? Is that a... Well, thanks for doing the podcast, Peter Biskind. It's
my pleasure.
I appreciate it, because I was also saying earlier that, you know, I have an ongoing list of people I want to talk to and have wanted to talk to for a long time, and your name is right up there. So this is a pleasure.
You.
Yeah, I know.
I'm flattered.
Well, how far will flattery get me?
It's a great way to meet people. It's the start of podcasts.
Hello. Exactly. It is. I've made so many. But
thought of it that way.
Yeah, I actually have made some really wonderful friends, just as a sort of incidentally, you know, but that keep coming back on, even when I don't invite them. It's they. You're always welcome back on, uninvited or invited. By the way, we're listening. We're talking to Peter Biskind about his latest book. This is your 6th or 7th?
I think it's my 8th.
8th book.
I don't count. I did a trivia book on on The Godfather.
Oh, right.
In a weak moment.
Godfather.
And I don't count that. It's like, you know, it's like filmmakers who made pornographic films where they were just starting and they leave them off their resume. I try to leave that off my resume.
Okay. I definitely want to look at it now, though, for the pictures. The Godfather Companion? Is that what's called?
Yes, it's called The Godfather Companion.
Right. I vaguely remember reading about it, too. This one, though, is called The Sky is Falling. Subtitle, How Vampires, Zombies, Androids, and Superheroes Made America Great for Extremism. So what does that mean? I guess that's what we can talk about.
I don't know. It's just kind of a catchy title that doesn't really mean anything. No.
I'm glad I got you joking around.
You know, what that means is that in a lot of the movies and TV shows that feature zombies, vampires, androids, and superheroes, imagine extreme situations, often the apocalypse of one sort or another, a zombie plague, I don't know, an invasion of vampires, all the superhero movies.
A plane crashing on a deserted island.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And or, you know, the superhero movies always feature, or often feature, alien invasions from outer space, you know, the appearance of a supervillain, whatever. In any event, these extreme situations are used in two different ways. By the mainstream, and we'll get to what that is in a minute. The mainstream uses extreme situations to show that the government and the authorities, quote unquote, and the government's agents, usually cops and docs or soldiers and scientists, can deal with an extreme situation. In other words, they function well. In what I'm calling extremist shows, the authorities either disappear, collapse in the face of a extreme situation of one kind or another, a holocaust, an apocalypse, or else they're corrupt and sometimes actually evil. So what these shows do, the vampire, zombies, whatever shows do, is they present extreme situations as often as an excuse for extreme measures. They make extreme measures look like the only option available to the characters, to the heroes. I mean, a great example of that is what I consider a right-wing show, 24. which excelled at imagining, you have an hour to avert the release of a dangerous plague on Los Angeles, or an hour and a half to avert a nuclear attack on Washington, D.C. And in that situation, anything, including torture, which Jack Bauer used frequently, is justified. So in arguing that extreme culture has sort of taken over American culture, it was necessary to sort of examine all these shows in which extreme situations exist, and those are the zombie, vampire, android, whatever shows.
Yes. You wrote this even before, like, one recent very popular show, Handmaid's Tale. That was probably just, I assume you were writing that on the cusp of that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a big fan of the Handmaid's Tale. I mean, I read the book when it came, years ago. It was a great book, but I found the show itself slow and boring. But that's neither here nor there. I mean, I did write this. I did write the book long before Handmaid's Tale came out.
Read it.
And
this one. Oh, you did read it. Write it rather before that.
Yeah, I started it during the Obama administration, and it's interesting because in those days you could see extremism raising its ugly head, but or as case may be, attractive head, depending on your point of view. But and a lot of the things I discussed were not in a common parlance in those days. But now, of course, extremism is a much more pressing issue, and it sort of changed the book a bit because it's no longer Obama, but it's Trump, and it's like two different, two completely different approaches.
You don't think you could get
American politics? You couldn't get more of a contrast.
Exactly. Did you go back in then and have to revise because the post-election stuff is all over this book? Well, I revised for a lot of different reasons.
I was constantly revising, and I revised for a lot of different reasons, and that was one of them. Yeah, I mean, I had to take things out, and I had to modify things, and then I had to put Trump in because he was such a great example of extremism.
Right. Yeah. It's only reinforced.
Well, I mean, the argument of the book is that we're headed in an extremist direction, thus extreme culture.
Okay.
But what I thought you were going to ask me was, to give some examples of how these shows break down politically.
That's what I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you about that.
Good. Then we're in a good
yeah. Well, you can't. Yeah. I mean, that's
I
more on a micro level, like asking about how specifically, like, let's say, a Walking Dead. You mentioned 24, which actually, it did coincide, very obviously, it kind of coincided with the Bush years, so it's not such a coincidence. And
they loved it, the Bush
I'm sure, because it kind of almost made torture okay and cool. Yeah.
Well, I want to actually start with Game of Thrones because Game of Thrones is a good example of what I call in the book a centrist or mainstream show. Even though, it features, it didn't feature any, maybe it does, vampires, and it does feature zombies. But even though it's set in a fantastical universe, past universe,
right.
It has a lot to tell us about our contemporary situation. And I call it a centrist show because it's permeated, I think, by centrist politics. And what I mean by that is it's set in a country called, not a country, but an area called Westeros, which is made up of 7 kingdoms. Each kingdom is run by a single family, and the family dynasties are constantly at war. And the most important value is loyalty to family. Now, that's an extremist value. In other words, the center values a larger political construct. It values the community. It values more abstract notions. I mean, from a centrist point of view, putting a premium on the family is mere tribalism. And in other words, kinship relationships. It's a primitive attitude, and we've evolved way beyond that, according to the mainstream. And so, what you had is a bunch of tribal wars throughout the 6 seasons of first 6 seasons of Game of Thrones, until the White Walkers, the zombies from the north that they're constantly anticipating, actually appear. And then all these tribal values go out the window, and Jon Snow, the King of the North, devotes himself to coalition building, which is a mainstream project. I mean, the mainstream values, another term for the mainstream is pluralism, which values tolerance, diversity, gathering people under a big tent. And their notion was the bigger the tent, the more diverse the tent, the more stable the society. Nevertheless, there were always people. There were people there were dissidents who didn't want to go into the tent, and there were also people that the mainstream, the pluralists didn't want under the tent, and they were abusively called extremists. And you had extremists of the extreme right and extremists of the extreme left. And because to get in under the tent, you had to play by the rules of the center, which were things like obey the rule of law, acknowledge the rule of law. As I said, values like diversity, tolerance, compromise over principle, et cetera, all those sort of democratic values that we learned as kids.
And civics.
So suddenly, getting back to Game of Thrones, suddenly Jon Snow is trying to create a coalition of all these warring families, and some of them don't. Some of them don't agree. Mainly Queen Cersei who occupies the Iron Throne in what do you call it? King's Landing. And so she's the extremist, and Snow is the centrist. And he says things like, something like, this is not his exact words, but the time for tribalism is over. What we're fighting for now is not family, but we're fighting for life itself.
Right.
In other words, the stakes, these zombies have raised the stakes so high that we can't afford these family wars anymore. And that essentially is a centrist point of view. Now, extremist films reject all of that. They would be on Cersei's side. Extremist shows turn the center upside down or inside out, however you want to say it. So what is good for the center is bad for the extremes, and what's bad for the center is good for the extremes. So for example, an extremist shows often show a loyalty to family, or loyalty to kinship ties. And the bad guys in The Walking Dead, Merle, do you remember Merle, who was he's Daryl's bad brother, right? And for a long time he becomes a henchman of Philip. Is it at that community? It's the first bad community. Can't remember the name of it at the moment, but in any event, he captures and tortures a couple of the characters in Rick's band, and Rick organizes a little war party, invades, this town, which I can't remember the name of, and frees them all. And they bring them back to the prison, which they're all, they've sort of set up their headquarters there. And the group of them that have been tortured object to bringing Merle back to the
makes sense.
So and they refuse. So Merle and Daryl go off by themselves. Now Daryl is sort of a good guy, but he says, Merle's blood, I'm going with him. And they encounter a Hispanic family which is being threatened by zombies, and Daryl goes to their aid, and Merle says something like, they ain't never made dinner for me,
right.
Heavy
Meaning
Southern accent.
They're not part of our
they're not
tribe.
part of our family.
Right.
They're not blood ties. So
why stick our neck out?
Yeah. So Daryl, that's too much for Daryl, and Daryl goes back to the rest of them, and Merle is kind of excluded. I mean, that's not quite the way it works, but more or less. In other words, The Walking Dead is also a centrist show, but they they try on extremism for good measure.
So there's a tension there between the two.
How far you can go. I mean,
Yeah.
in other words, the question in The Walking Dead is it justified to do anything for survival, to save yourself? And at a certain point, Rick, who is the leader of the good guys, kind of experiments with really bad behavior. In one scene, he actually behaves like a zombie, and he jumps on one of his captors and takes a big chunk of flesh out of his neck with his teeth, and later on he regrets it and he apologizes and he comes back to the center. So a lot of these shows are like laboratories where they're investigating essentially social issues that concern everyone. And even though they're set in very, fantastical situations.
Yeah. Do you think people are thinking about these things as they watch them in any?
Yeah, I think some people are, but I think a lot of these messages are invisible.
Yeah.
And
right.
The more
maybe even to the people that create the shows.
Well, I think a lot of the people who create the shows are fairly conscious. I mean, sometimes they're not conscious, but I think they are. I mean,
a show like 24, it seems pretty obvious.
Yeah, and I mean, and it was Gail Hurd, who is one of the showrunners of, or one of the producers of The Walking Dead, who told me that, from her point of view, one of the big issues in the show is are you justified in doing anything?
Right.
But
that's good to hear.
I think that, these messages are more effective the less visible they are. I mean, if you watch, look, if Trump is an extremist like Trump is elected president, people take notice. But if they're watching hundreds of shows where the hero employs vigilante violence, you eventually get inured to it and you don't notice it anymore. And so, shows like science fiction and horror movies and westerns that have no apparent politics are the most effective in conveying these kinds of values. I mean, I interviewed Edgar Wright, who made Shaun of the Dead, and he compared his movies to Trojan horses, and said that under the guise of a zombie movie, he would smuggle in other themes. And I think he's pretty conscious of doing that.
We know fairy tales are known to be the same kind of delivery system, right?
Bettelheim, investigated fairy tales. So I think it's the same principles.
Yeah, I see. So you're the Bruto Bettelheim of the cable of the streaming age.
I didn't mean to nail myself with that. But
what was the research involved here? Because I mean, I jotted down just a few of the series on the way over here. I was thinking about your book goes over, and this is just a fraction, by the way. Lost, Game of Thrones, as we've talked about, Walking Dead, what was the religious one, the Christian?
Well, there's a bunch of books called The Left Behind,
and there was a series based on that.
Leftovers. Well,
Leftovers.
That series was actually based on a book by,
Go ahead.
by Tom Perrotta.
Okay.
And it's a little different. I mean, it's a lot different from The Left Behinds because that's a straight out evangelical show, and the Leftovers is a little more modest in its.
I understand in terms of the message that we're talking about, but I'm just even thinking about your research because you have to watch all these shows. 24. These are just a few. Some of these shows obviously are so well written and so well produced that you just would want to watch them as a fan, but clearly you had to watch even more so probably for research, correct?
Correct.
And the films that keep coming up, we mentioned a lot of the superheroes, both DC and Marvel universes, and Avatar is a big film that comes up a lot in the book for its liberal take, because it's such an extreme liberal, to use your terminology. That's a good example of an extreme liberal show. Right. So what did you...
Beyond liberal.
Were you watching the shows? Well, you mentioned at the very beginning that this is sort of a sequel to your first book. So maybe you had been planning this for a while as you watched all these series coming out and that were really connecting with the mass audiences. I mean, Walking Dead is, I think, the most popular cable series ever made to date.
Well, when I saw Avatar, which came out in 2009, I was not thinking about this so much. But, excuse me, I mean, my first book was about movies of the 50s, Hollywood movies of the 50s, and that was the 50s was a high tide of post-war consensus culture, which was shoved aside by this extreme culture. And so I decided, things have changed a lot since the 50s. You know, you go back to that 40, 50 years later, and you see that mainstream culture has been overtaken by extremist culture, and it's bifurcated into extreme left and extreme right, and that was sort of the genesis of the book. But some of the things I started watching before I started working on the book, and others I started watching because I was doing the book. You know, anything with zombie in the title, I felt I had to watch.
Yeah.
You know, and like anything else, there are good zombie shows and bad zombie shows.
Are there more than one or two?
Oh, yeah, there's a ton of them.
There are?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
I mean, if you count the movies, there's a lot of zombie
sure.
movies.
Oh, my God, endless number. Yeah, and vampire movies. Another series that we should mention, of course, that comes up a lot is True Blood. That's
True
another
Blood, which I
mentioned.
thought was an extremely well-written show.
Me too,
You know?
yeah.
As I said, some of these shows are very, very skillfully done.
Right.
I mean, you have to, I guess, if you're going to go through that many seasons.
Well, yeah. Which also, you know, what I was thinking about were, because I guess even though I appreciated and I watched several seasons of, I think, The Walking Dead as a fan, and I tried a couple of these other shows, I tend to, and maybe you can tell already, I tend to gravitate towards more the sort of more dramatic, character, driven, character oriented stories. So The Sopranos, of course, is a high point for me. And first couple of seasons of Dexter, I was finding, and Nurse Jackie, I was finding that the hero of these different series were anti-heroes. They were, mobsters, drug addicts, and serial killers. And yet we loved them. The real trick of these shows for me was that they were able to write that very, very narrow space where they were always had to be likable. There was something compelling about them that you cared about their future.
That's absolutely right. I mean, I call them the good bad guys, you know, and taking bad guys and making them into good guys. I think, again, you could argue that that's another example of extremism, because you make what used to be, 30 years ago, you didn't have gangsters and dope addicts and serial killers as the heroes of your shows.
Yeah. I was trying to think of that, and I'm sure there's some examles, but
there are other
occasionally Bogart would play.
Well, there are other reasons for it. I mean, like,
or Cagney.
I quoted David Chase, who gave me a great quote about network television, broadcast television being devoted to showing that American institutions work. And so you have, the courthouse, the precinct house, the schoolhouse, the White House, and those shows, all those network shows are devoted to showing that the agents in these institutions really, as David Chase said, really gave a shit. They might have some blemishes, they might be alcoholics or whatever, but they really cared. They were at heart really good people. And the development of the onslaught of cable, where a lot of the standards and practices which govern network television went by the boards, and then now the streaming services, and then the proliferation of new devices on which these shows are seen, has done a lot to disperse and disrupt mainstream culture. So it's not only, there are a lot of reasons for it, but that's another one.
Right, and the culture, as you mentioned, is very bifurcated. Well, that's why Trump is so important to your book, this timing, because we've never been so at odds or bifurcated as a bifurcated culture. And then also we have so much content which is created for those specific two spots, like, so you don't have to ever hear, or there's an entire community around that and media around just for the choir,
Yeah.
Which is a kind of
the talk shows now devoted to the Talking Dead,
Oh, right.
And a lot of those shows, that's I think the first example that I noticed. But a lot of those other shows have at least a 15-minute documentary tacked onto the finale of the last season or something like that. Where they talk about the actors, directors, whatever, talk about the shows.
Yeah,
there's a meta discussion going on that that used to be called in the old days water cooler conversations in offices, and now they're being incorporated into the
I think we have to wind down soon, because I know I want to mention, correct? I don't know.
I think the thing starts at 7.
At 7, so
we have a little more time.
Okay, good.
If
this
you
is
want
great.
okay.
No, are you kidding me? This is a kidding. as long as you want to. Happy to walk with you, and I'll carry the equipment right up to Book Culture on Columbus Avenue. We may as well, even though this is coming out, this will have to be just after this, but you're here to do this one of, I'm sure, many book events for The Sky is Falling. By the way, I want to mention that it's being published by the New Press. Thanks to the folks at New Press for helping coordinate us sitting here now. And it's currently available.
I'll second that.
Oh, thank you.
Great.
Yeah. And I thought you meant sitting with me.
Sitting with you is
I
great
hope
too.
it's a positive experience for you. But the book, The Sky is Falling, is currently available where books are sold, downloaded, etc.
Right.
I guess you have to say that.
Pirated, right.
And pirated. That's right. And I recommend everybody get it. Peter Biskind is also the author, though, of several other books, and they are seminal books. And I do want to mention that for so many people, especially of, who look like me, I guess. I don't know. The Easy Riders and Raging Bulls. You can't not mention this book. It's so seminal. Writing it in, what year did it come out? It was certainly after Raging Bull.
1998.
That really 20 years ago.
So it's seminal. I expect it to have babies any moment.
It's almost drinking age because it's 20 years old as of now. So
20 years old. Yeah,
your book can drink
this year.
Yeah.
It's the 20th anniversary.
I think it's an opportunity to repackage this or revise it.
I tried to get a publisher to do it. For some reason, they weren't interested. So what can I say?
Fuck them. Sorry, it's not appropriate.
Say that. You did.
I said it. What a major book, though, for so many people. People still talk about this book all the time. Did you have any sense that you were writing something that was going to connect so strongly with?
The answer to that is yes and no. First of all, the no part is you never know.
Of course not.
You have no idea how a book is going to be received. But on the yes part, I had been a magazine editor for so many years. First, I edited a magazine called American Film, which is many years deceased. And then I was executive editor of Premiere Magazine, and I was very familiar with the kinds of reporting, Hollywood reporting that people did, that I did, and everybody, as an editor, all my writers did. And I knew that I'd gone way beyond that in this book. So I was actually scared when the book came out because I felt like I'd sort of put a stick of dynamite in the mail, but I had no idea that it was going to be received so enthusiastically. I mean, it was it's weird though, because it's sort of like when you make your first film, like, Rafelson and Five Easy Pieces, or, Bogdanovich in the God forbid I should compare myself to great filmmakers, but when your first work it wasn't my first work, but it was
right.
My first book came out way before that. Everything else is downhill afterwards.
Bogdanovich was Target, right?
Yeah, his first work was Target. Yeah. But it's a great experience, which every writer should have. Believe me,
really,
it was wonderful.
Yeah.
It
was actually even adapted into a motion picture. Did you know that?
Well, it was in a documentary.
I know. I'm kind of.
Actually, it's been optioned.
Is that okay?
I don't want to mention it. I
don't want to
mention who. And
so is it just so this way we can even excise it? But as a
series.
Oh, as a series.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay.
I mean, it's a hard book to. It's a hard book to do because there's so many stories in it. You have to really prune it and focus it,
right?
Because there's like 6 or 7, 10 major figures in the book, and they go through the whole book. So
yeah. Well, I mean, like a series adapted. It's a different structure than a film version might be, right, or whatever other medium we're talking about. Down and Dirty Pictures. You did a book with.
Thanks to Harvey Weinstein.
Yeah, that's right.
It's gotten a second life.
It's for other very different reasons, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's right. Miramax. So I mean, it's a can of worms. So I'm not going to bring it up because it would just be another half-hour conversation on that. So and then I should also mention, sort of bouncing up around a little bit, but the event you're going to is being moderated by another very important figure in the history of James Schamus.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, he started at Good Machine.
With Ted Hope.
Ted Hope, went to Focus Features, and spent many years there, and did many wonderful movies, Breakback Mountain, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, all sorts of things.
Created Ang Lee.
And well, I don't know if he created, but
No,
he certainly was partly responsible for Ang Lee's career. And yeah, he's a seminal figure. And on the side, he teaches at Columbia University and writes scripts. So he's sort of a Renaissance man.
Mm-hmm.
And he has a house upstate around where I live.
Oh, up in upstate. That's right. You are involved in a film festival.
And
it's coming up.
I run a film festival which is coming up the third week of October, and it's actually a terrific festival. And when we started, James gave us our sort of anchor films, because when we started we had nothing. To start a festival in a sort of small town is like inventing the wheel. And I couldn't get anything. And James would give us those films, Brokeback Mountain and Crouching Tiger and a couple of others. Every year we would get a big focus film.
Right.
And if it weren't for that, I don't think we ever would have gotten off the ground. So he's certainly instrumental in helping us create this festival.
It's called the Hudson Valley. Am I right?
Am
I wrong?
Called Film Columbia because it's in Columbia County.
It's called Film Columbia.
Yeah, one word.
Film Columbia Festival? Festival? Or whatever, just Film Columbia.
Well,
I was going to attend because last year, and I did not.
Last year we had a banner year. We had Lady Bird, and we had 3 billboards, and we had I, Tanya. It was amazing.
That is amazing. All Oscar-nominated.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, a film I was an associate producer on played at your festival.
Which
it's called
one?
Born. I knew I was going to screw it up. Born Guilty, with Rosanna Arquette.
That was a while ago. Right?
That was last year.
Was it last year?
Yeah. That's how long ago it may have felt to you if you saw it.
Well, I guess you would know, but
yeah, no, I'm unless no, because I tried to come.
Festival?
Wanted to come. It's very possible, but I remember.
One festival is the same as another.
No, but I remember reaching out. I don't want to drag this on. It's not great podcasting necessarily, but I remember reaching out because I did see your name associated with the festival, so it makes sense that it would have been the one that you're talking about. But I'll fact check. I remember because I was very excited by the idea of coming up and trying to talk to you there. So, but maybe I'll come up to Film Columbia.
Yeah,
is it in the fall?
It's in the third week of October. It's coming up.
So I think I might skip another upstate festival this year and come to yours.
Okay.
I don't know if you know which one I'm referring to, but they released their.
I can't badmouth other festivals.
No, I would not ask you, and I wouldn't encourage you to do that. We're all one big happy community most of the time. Anyway,
unless we're not.
I hear you. So last time, Peter Biskind is again the author. The Sky is Falling: How Vampires, Zombies, Androids, and Superheroes Made America Great for Extremism. And it's just terrific having you on my little podcast here. But hopefully, I don't know. Hopefully you'll come back on and we can talk about other stuff in the future.
Okay. I'll be happy to.
Yeah. Thanks again.
Okay. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. I'll turn it on. This is the after the show informal conversation.
I turned off
podcast. It's like Oprah after the show,
it's like
walking
close to Newcastle. What?
The Talking Dead. For like this is sort of this is where we sit back and have a beer. And I'm joking because I turned off the recorder and you.
No, I said how much I enjoyed the podcast and talking to you.
Well, thank you. And I should mention, I've been wanting to get Seamus on because I do bring on a lot of people from the industry, and Ted Hope has been on several times over the years. Not since he went
James
to Amazon.
Would be great. He's extremely articulate. He's a wonderful speaker.
That's what I'm afraid of, because then I'm, having to catch up.
You'll do fine.
Okay, thank you. Thanks again. Okay, that was the postscript.
I've never had more fun in my life.